It is said that the sea remembers what the land forgets. On nights when the moon lowers itself to the edge of the water, and the wind moves like a prayer across the surface, one can almost hear the faint echo of oars, dipping, rising, dipping again, a rhythm that once carried empires to their fate. There, along a nameless coast now half swallowed by the tide, the earth exhales a slow breath through the ruins. Shards of amphorae lie like broken constellations beneath the sand. Fragments of anchors, dulled by centuries of salt, glint faintly beneath the moonlight. The air is thick with the scent of brine and dust and something older still, something that belongs not to the sea or the wind, but to memory itself. Once, these shores were alive with voices. Markets thrummed with trade. Temples sang to gods whose names have turned to vapor. Copper met bronze beneath the hands of smiths, and ships creaked in the harbors like sleeping beasts. Somewhere beyond the horizon, kingdoms thrived. Mycenae, Ugarit, Hattusa, names once carved in pride. Yet all of them would one day fall silent, their words carried away by a people without a homeland, without a tongue that survived the telling. They called them the Sea Peoples, a phrase, nothing more, a placeholder for the unknown. They came not from a single place, but from the dissolving edges of a collapsing world. They came as exiles, wanderers, raiders, refugees. To some, they were the destroyers of an age. To others, merely the wind that scattered the ashes already burning. Beneath the darkened moon, their ships moved like ghosts. No banners marked them, no records bore their true names. Their sails were woven from desperation, their eyes lit by the fires of cities left behind. In their wake, the world of bronze, the first great network of civilization, cracked like an old shell. It is said the first to fall was a coastal city whose harbor once gleamed with golden light. The smoke rose so slowly that the sun itself seemed dimmed. A mother pressed her child's hand into wet clay, a handprint, a last trace, before the walls came down. The letter she sent, written on soft tablets, would never be delivered. It was found centuries later, still folded, still waiting for an answer. Each ruin along this coastline hums with such ghosts. Perhaps it was never meant to be understood, only felt. It is said that a map is not a piece of parchment, but a memory of the world as it once was, a reflection of how people believed the earth breathed beneath them. Long before compasses, before globes and grids, before the north was fixed by the pull of invisible iron, maps were prayers. They were the earth turned into language, the divine drawn in ink. And among the ruins of the old Bronze Age world, archaeologists once found such a prayer, carved not in paper, but in clay. It was small enough to fit into a single hand, its lines faint, its edges cracked. A coastline curved across its surface, a river wound like a serpent, and at its center a symbol shaped like an open eye. No words explained it, no directions marked its edges. Yet those who studied it knew what it was, a map of a world that no longer exists. The clay came from Babylonian soil, and its age was older than most kings. It was drawn when cities still traded across the great routes of the Bronze Age, when copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, and gold from Nubia crossed hands like promises. The world it described was whole, unbroken. Ports alive with sails, markets humming with grain, priests offering wine to gods of sun and storm. But just as the ink of that ancient world dried, something shifted. The map became wrong. The rivers changed course. The cities it marked began to vanish. Historians call this time the Bronze Age collapse, a slow unraveling that turned the known world to myth. The Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites in Anatolia, the Egyptians in their weakened dynasties, all found themselves staring at a map that no longer matched the earth. The trade winds faltered, famine hollowed the fields, and then came the wanderers, the sea peoples, like currents moving through the cracks of empire. It is said that the map's final owner tried to redraw it. He pressed a stylus into soft clay, tracing the new paths of the rivers, the new coastlines of a world in retreat. But as he worked, the tremors of an earthquake split his workshop, and the tablet cracked in two. Both halves were found centuries later, sealed in a layer of ash. The map had survived, but the world it described had not. If you look closely at its surface, you can still see faint scratches, coordinates erased and redrawn, like someone trying to hold the earth still while it shifted beneath his feet. Perhaps it was not a geographer who made it, but a priest. Perhaps it was drawn as a ritual to preserve what was vanishing. In those days, maps were sacred objects. The Egyptians carved them on tomb walls to guide souls through the afterlife. The Babylonians etched theirs on tablets that placed their city at the center of the universe, surrounded by an ocean called the Bitter River. To draw a map was to define existence itself, to name what was real and what was lost. When the world began to crumble, maps became memorials. Imagine the last scribe of Ugarit, his hands blackened with soot, copying the shape of his kingdom onto clay even as fire rose outside the walls. Imagine a merchant from Mycenae, rolling out a hide map on the deck of his ship, tracing the trade routes that no longer existed. Imagine the priest of Hattusa, laying his palm on a cracked relief of the earth and whispering to the gods, asking where the world had gone. When archaeologists walk these ancient sites now, they find maps everywhere. Not drawn as we know them, but encoded into walls and alignments. Temples built to mirror the stars. City streets angled toward solstices. Tombs aligned with the setting sun. The ancients mapped not just geography, but divinity. Every direction was a form of prayer. Every horizon a boundary between this world and another. The echo of laughter from a vanished marketplace. And yet all those maps of land, of sky, of faith were undone. The fall of the Bronze Age redrew the world. Roads vanished into wilderness. Ports filled with silt. Writing systems disappeared. For nearly 400 years, silence spread like mist. The mapmakers were gone. The world had to remember itself from fragments. Some say that the ancient map unearthed near Babylon bears a faint mark in its lower corner. A spiral, carved so lightly it can barely be seen. The same spiral appears on the wrecks of ships found near Cyprus. The same mark is found on pottery buried deep beneath the ruins of Crete. No one knows what it meant. Some believe it was a symbol of the sea peoples themselves, a sign of movement, of eternal return. Others think it was older still, the emblem of the first navigators, who followed the stars before nations had names. The spiral turns both inward and outward. It is a shape that moves forever, without end or beginning. Perhaps it was drawn to remind the mapmaker that no map is ever final, that the world, like the sea, is always changing its face. When the night falls over the ruins of those old ports, Byblos, Tyre, Ugarit, Knossos, the sea still reaches them in soft waves, tracing invisible lines along the sand. You can almost see the old coastlines flicker there, the outlines of vanished harbors glimmering under moonlight like faded ink. It is as though the sea itself remembers where the land once stood. Today, in museums, the fragment of that Babylonian map lies under glass. Visitors pass by, unaware that they are looking at the world's first attempt to define space, to say, here is where we are. His creator could not have known that he was recording the last image of a united world. Within a generation, that world would vanish, and the idea of distance, trade, and connection would sleep for centuries before being born again. And yet, the impulse to draw, to record, to remember endures. Every modern map, every chart, every digital image of the earth is a continuation of that ancient act, the attempt to make meaning from motion, to pin the ungraspable, to tame the shifting. It is said that when the sea people sailed, they carried no maps. They followed the stars and the rhythm of the waves. Theirs was a cartography of faith, trusting the horizon, not the line. Perhaps that is why they survived when empires fell. For those who draw maps upon the sea know that no boundary is ever permanent, and no world is ever lost, only changed. The clay map cracked long ago. Its river no longer flows, its coast no longer curves as it once did. Yet its meaning remains. To hold it is to hold the breath between eras, the moment when humanity realized the world could disappear beneath its own feet. Some say that the eye carved in its center was not meant to mark a city at all, but a watcher, the gaze of the gods looking back. Others believe it was a symbol of the sea, which sees everything, remembers everything, and erases nothing. The scent of charred cedar carried in the night air. Perhaps that is why, When one looks long enough into the still water, it feels as though the world is looking back. It is said that this map did not end the world. The world ended itself, and the map simply bore witness. But in doing so, it became something greater. A promise that what is lost can still be traced, that even when coastlines vanish, memory leaves its mark. And as you listen to the soft breath of the sea, to the tide folding against the ruins, imagine that ancient map resting somewhere below. The clay cool, the lines faint but unbroken. It waits in the silence, not to guide, but to remind, that every ending draws its own shape upon the earth. A coastline fading into starlight, a river that no longer knows its name, a map that tried to hold the world still, and instead captured the moment it began to move. It is said that there was once a night when all the kings of the earth dreamed the same dream. In it, their palaces crumbled like sand under rain, their banners burned without wind, and their names were carried away by a sound that was neither storm nor silence, but something in between, the breath of an age ending. That night did not come all at once. It moved like a shadow, drifting from kingdom to kingdom, from torch to torch, dimming each in turn. In the western hills, the citadels of Mycenae and Tiryns stood proud against the sky, their walls of stone thick and sure. In Egypt, the last pharaohs of the new kingdom still held their ceremonies beneath the stars. And far to the north, the cities of Hattusa and Ugarit, though scarred by hunger and tremor, still whispered the prayers of their ancestors. Yet beneath their marble floors and painted chambers, something had already begun to loosen, a slow, inevitable unraveling. It began, perhaps, with the silence of the messengers. A letter sent from Hattusa went unanswered. A caravan from Cyprus never arrived. Ships that once crossed the Aegean came home empty, or not at all. The trade routes that had bound the Bronze Age world together like veins in a living body began to dry. Kings who had once ruled through connection found themselves alone. In Mycenae, the scribes kept careful lists of rations, of offerings, of names. But in the final tablets, their writing grows uneven, hurried. One tablet, discovered near the Lion Gate, records only this: "We are watching the horizon. The ships are many. After that, there is nothing." The city's great halls fell silent, its frescoes blackened by smoke. The gold masks that once gleamed in burial chambers now lay buried under ash. The sea, calm and endless, swallows it all without distinction, conqueror and conquered alike. In Egypt, Pharaoh Ramesses III would one day carve his victory upon the walls of Medinet Habu, depicting his triumph over the sea peoples. Yet even his kingdom, though it survived the storm, was never the same. The treasury emptied, the temples went unpainted, and famine crept through the villages. The Nile flowed, but its gift had grown thin. The age of divine kingship was ending, even as the monuments stood. In Hattusa, the royal archives were sealed with wax for the last time. The last king, Suppiluliuma II, sent pleas for aid written in cuneiform. Fragile messages pressed into clay, addressed to allies who no longer existed. The empire that had ruled the heart of Anatolia for centuries fell not in a single battle, but in a long exhale. Its palaces were abandoned to the weeds, its gods forgotten by the very priests who once fed them incense and song. And so it was across the world, thrones emptying one by one, each kingdom collapsing inward like a dying star. No single hand caused it. Famine, war, migration, earthquakes, the scholars still argue. But perhaps, as some whisper, it was not calamity at all, but renewal. The end of one breath, the beginning of another. Imagine that night, not filled with noise, but with absence. The torches of the citadels burning low, the air heavy with dust, the sound of distant waves, faint but unrelenting, reaching even those who lived far from the sea. In palace after palace, kings woke from uneasy dreams, unable to name the unease they felt. They rose from their beds and walked their halls, past statues whose eyes seemed to glimmer with pity. They stepped out onto terraces overlooking sleeping cities, and though the wind was still, the banners moved. In Thebes, a high priest is said to have looked up at the sky that night and seen the stars shifting. Constellations that had marked the same paths for centuries seemed to tremble. In that trembling, he read the truth, that heaven itself was turning a page. He called it the Night of Falling Thrones. The phrase endured, whispered from one broken age to another. It does not mean rebellion or battle, but the quiet recognition that nothing built by human hands can last. Archaeologists walking through these ruins find the evidence written not in stone, but in absence. The doorways that lead nowhere, the courtyards whose fountains are filled with dust, the tools left in haste, as though their owners meant to return in the morning but never did. In Mycenae, the palatial corridors are littered with fragments of pottery still black with soot. In Hattusa, tablets lie scattered across the floors like fallen leaves, each one an unanswered letter. And in the deserts of Egypt, half-buried reliefs still bear the faces of kings whose names the wind has worn away. It is said that when an age dies, it does not vanish, but folds into the earth, waiting to be remembered. The fallen thrones became the soil of new kingdoms. From the ashes of Mycenae rose the faint outlines of Athens, still young and uncertain. From the silence of Hattusa came the voices of the Phrygians, whose music echoed down the mountains. The fall of one language gave birth to another. The gods changed their names, but their stories continued. Some say the sea peoples were only the hand of fate, not destroyers but midwives of a new world. Others say they were simply the symptom of the same hunger that claimed the kings. Whatever the truth, the night they came marked the passing of an age. Some believe the sea peoples were punished wanderers, driven by the wrath of the gods. Others say they were survivors of a vanished island, perhaps Atlantis, scattered across the currents after the earth itself betrayed them. There are whispers that they were guided by stars now erased from the sky, celestial cartographers of their own exile. When you stand among the ruins now, under the open sky, you can almost feel the weight of that night. The stillness is immense. The wind moves through broken doorways with a sound like breath. It feels as though time itself is holding its inhale. It is said that a throne, once fallen, becomes part of the ground that receives it. The stones that once held kings become steps for wanderers. The gold once worn by emperors melts into dust that feeds the roots of olive trees. In that way, the past continues not as power but as patience. And perhaps that is the lesson whispered by the Night of Falling Thrones. That all the walls we build are only pauses in the eternal rhythm of creation and collapse. That every crown, no matter how bright, is only borrowed light. That even as the torches die, the stars remain, steady and indifferent. When the moon rose over Mycenae's empty gate, when the fires of Hattusa cooled into ash, when the pharaoh's reliefs dried beneath the desert wind, the world did not end. It simply exhaled, and from that exhalation came silence, long, deep, and filled with possibility. It is said that if you listen closely in the ruins, you can still hear the echo of that silence. It is not mournful. It is not afraid. It is the sound of the earth remembering itself, preparing once again to begin. And as the stars turned slowly above the fallen thrones, the night accepted what even the kings could not. That no crown lasts forever, and that every ending, like every dawn, belongs to the same eternal light. It is said that there was once a season when the earth forgot how to give. The rains, once faithful as breath, no longer came. The rivers, once singing with silver, shrank into veins of dust. The fields cracked open beneath the sun like broken pottery, and the grain that had sustained empires turned to husk. It was then that the world began to starve, not only of food but of faith. This was the late Bronze Age, though no one who lived through it called it that. For them, it was simply the waiting. Farmers rose before dawn to touch the soil, searching for moisture that was no longer there. Priests lifted their hands toward a sky that had turned the color of brass. And from Anatolia to Canaan, from the islands of the Aegean to the deltas of the Nile, the same prayer was whispered, "Let the rains return." But the skies remained silent. Archaeologists uncover their passing in fragments. A broken blade, a child's necklace, burnt grains sealed in pottery. But no inscription, no language, no self-description. They lived between the lines of other civilizations, mentioned in Egyptian reliefs as enemies, feared, yet unnamed. Even the pharaohs could not hold them back. Archaeologists have found it written in the very bones of the earth. Layers of sediment, dry and brittle tree rings that show decades of thirst. The paleoclimate records tell of years without rivers, of winds that grew hotter and sharper, of lakes retreating from their shores. Crops failed again and again. The people who had once traded copper and tin now traded what little they could eat. Livestock died first, then cities, then gods. In the highlands of Anatolia, the Hittites sent out expeditions in search of grain, their royal archives filled with letters of desperation. Send us wheat, send us life. None came. In Egypt, the Nile, the sacred artery of civilization, began to falter. Its floods grew unpredictable, its promise unreliable. The granaries emptied, and the priests of Ammonius walked the temple corridors barefoot, their chants rasping through the heat. Even Pharaoh, that living god, began to look smaller beneath the sun. It is said that in Canaan, entire villages vanished, their wells dry, their altars left with offerings untouched. People wandered toward the coasts, following rumors of food. They found only war. The sea peoples moved along the same paths. Refugees, raiders, survivors, all driven by the same hunger that had begun in the soil. And so famine became the truest conqueror of that age. It needed no army, no sword. It crept quietly, unchallenged, through fields and temples alike. The world's great empires fell not to battle, but to barrenness. The Bronze Age, which had been born of abundance, died of thirst. Yet even in that desolation, there were rituals, small, stubborn gestures of hope. In a village near what is now Syria, archaeologists uncovered a stone basin filled with blackened grain, sealed beneath a layer of ash. It was not food. It was an offering, a harvest given back to the earth that would not return it. Beside it lay a small tablet inscribed with a plea to the goddess of fertility. If we die, remember us in the next rain. In Crete, fragments of frescoes show figures holding sheaves of barley, their faces serene, their eyes closed. Some say these were painted before the drought, others say after, when memory was the only harvest left. In Egypt's tomb paintings, the gods of plenty began to fade, replaced by symbols of survival, serpents, rivers, and the sun's harsh circle. It is strange to think how quietly an age can end, not with battle or flame, but with waiting, with cracked lips and hollow hands, with silence where there was once song. The people must have watched the skies each evening, hoping for clouds, for wind, for even the smell of rain. Instead, they saw only the stars, bright, eternal, untouched by their suffering. And perhaps they began to wonder if the gods had turned away, or if they had simply grown weary of listening. One relief shows ships colliding upon the waves, spears flashing in the sun. Yet even that battle, etched in stone, feels less like conquest and more like surrender. The world was changing. Trade routes faltered, kingdoms burned from within, and famine swept across the lands. The sea peoples, perhaps, were not destroyers but messengers, heralds of an age that could no longer sustain itself. In the ruins of Tel Twine, near the Syrian coast, a letter was found written in Ugaritic script, the same as the tablets of Ugarit. It reads simply, "The fields are gone, the threshing floors are empty. We wait." There is no ending to the letter. The scribe stopped mid-line, as if interrupted by the truth of his own words. That waiting, that long ache of the earth, became a wound carved into history. When the rains finally did return, they fell upon a world that had already changed. The empires were gone. The trade routes were forgotten. The people who rose in their place spoke new tongues, prayed to new gods. The old age had passed quietly into dust. But not all was lost, for from that silence, something began to grow, not from soil, but from endurance. The survivors learned to live closer to the land. They turned to iron, to simpler tools, to smaller dreams. Their songs spoke no longer of kings, but of seasons. They remembered the cost of abundance and the humility of waiting. It is said that the first Iron Age farmers looked at the horizon differently, not as a promise, but as a reminder. They built their homes near streams, not rivers. Their temples were smaller, their prayers quieter. The gods had not disappeared. They had become part of the wind, of the rain, of the turning earth itself. And yet, the memory of that hunger never faded. In myths written centuries later, one can still hear its echo: the tale of Joseph's famine in Egypt, the droughts that haunted the Hebrew prophets, the Greek stories of Demeter searching for her lost child and withholding the harvest until she was found. Perhaps these are not separate stories at all, but fragments of one memory, the memory of the harvest that never came. When dusk falls now over the Mediterranean plains, the air grows still in a way that feels ancient. The wheat fields rustle softly, and the soil breathes in the evening dew. If you listen closely, you might hear it, the faint sound of a world remembering its thirst. It is said that the earth forgives, but never forgets. Every seed carries within it the story of every famine that came before. Every drop of rain is the echo of a prayer once spoken by a starving hand. And so the harvest did return, but not as it once was. It came smaller, humbler, more sacred. It came with the memory of loss, so that humanity would never again take abundance for granted. Perhaps that is why the ancients built altars not only to gods of rain, but to gods of drought. They knew that balance, not plenty, was the truest gift. And when we look at the dry riverbeds that still thread across the old Bronze Age lands, we see not ruin, but rhythm, the pulse of a planet that remembers everything. Beneath the surface, the ocean floor is strewn with their memories. Bronze helmets softened by centuries, cargo once bound for forgotten ports. Amphories still cradle traces of oil, wine, grain, the scent of ordinary life, preserved in salt. Divers who descend to those depths speak of an eerie stillness, as if time itself has settled to rest. Their flashlights pass over mosaics blurred by coral, the faint outline of a prow carved with symbols no one can read. It is said that one day, when the last traces of those fallen empires are gone, and the earth has reclaimed their stones, the rains will whisper again, not to wash away the past, but to bless it. And in that whisper, the world will hear its oldest promise renewed, that from dust comes life, and from silence the song of the next beginning. It is said there comes a moment in every civilization when the gods grow quiet, not in anger, not in absence, but in weariness, as if they, too, have seen enough of the world's sorrow. In the final years of the Bronze Age, when the empires began to fall and the sea carried more wreckage than trade, the altars still stood, the incense still burned, but the heavens no longer answered. Across the lands once bright with devotion, the temples began to fade. In Thebes, the priests of Ammonius still raised their hymns before dawn, though their voices echoed through half-empty halls. The great columns, once fragrant with myrrh and cedar smoke, were choked by dust. In Hattusa, the sanctuary of the storm god Tarhunt lay in ruins, its stone lions crumbling at the gate. In Ugarit, the temples of Baal and Asherah were silent, their offerings untouched, their idols blackened by fire. The gods who had once spoken through wind and flame had withdrawn behind a veil of stillness. Archaeologists, centuries later, would find traces of this abandonment. Altars where the ashes had cooled mid-ceremony, shrines sealed hastily, votive figurines toppled and left where they fell. In some temples they found offerings buried under layers of rubble, jars of oil, small bronze bowls, amulets in the shape of eyes. It was as if the people had tried one last time to reach the divine, then, failing, turned away in silence. Sometimes, under a certain moon, the current seems to hum, a low, vibrating tone that could be mistaken for the song of oars. Fishermen speak of phantom ships appearing in the mist, sails white as bone, vanishing before the dawn. They do not haunt, one elder once said. They remember, but the silence was not empty. It was full of questions. In Egypt, the priests debated in whispers whether the gods had forsaken mankind or whether mankind had simply forgotten how to listen. The Nile still flowed, the sun still rose, but the divine order, the ma'at that bound heaven and earth, seemed to fray. A hymn written on papyrus from this time ends abruptly after one final plea. Why do you hide your face from us? In Anatolia, where the Hittites had once prayed for rain, new gods began to appear, Smaller, humbler local spirits of spring and stone. The old pantheon, vast and intricate, no longer held meaning. Its great temples, once centers of prophecy and ritual, became hollow chambers filled with echoes. The faith that had ruled for centuries dissolved into fragments, each village clinging to its own quiet deity, each offering made not with certainty, but with hope. And on the shores of the Aegean, where the palaces of Mycenae and Tiryns lay in ruin, the people began to tell new stories. Stories not of distant, unchanging gods, but of flawed ones. Gods who wept, who wandered, who could be deceived. Out of the ashes of the old religions, myth was born. The divine had descended, grown human, learned to suffer. It is said that the sea peoples, who sailed across that dying world, carried with them the remnants of countless faiths, fragments of idols, symbols carved on bone and shell, each representing a god who no longer ruled. They wove these fragments together, blending the divine into something unrecognizable yet familiar, a patchwork of memory, grief, and hope. Wherever they landed, they left behind not conquest, but confusion. A world where every god had turned away, and yet every stone still felt sacred. The silence of the divine changed the shape of belief. No longer was the world seen as governed by gods who ruled from above. Instead, the sacred was sought within the earth, in water, in stars. People began to listen differently, to the hum of wind through broken columns, to the rhythm of waves against the shore. The temples, though abandoned, still held a strange peace. They became places not of worship, but of remembering. When the archaeologists unearthed the Temple of Baal in Ugarit, they found at its center a fallen stele carved with a storm god holding lightning in his hand. The upper half of the figure was shattered. The lower half remained intact. It was as though the sky itself had vanished, leaving only the earth behind. Perhaps that was the truth of it, that the gods had not turned away at all, but descended into the world they once ruled. Their temples became mountains, their statues became dust, their voices became the sea. The people of the Iron Age, who rose after the silence, spoke of gods who lived closer to them, gods of hearth and harvest, of wind and stone. They no longer prayed to the unreachable heavens, but to the spirits that dwelled within their own breath. The divine had moved inward, and so the gods who had withdrawn did not vanish. They became presence itself, unseen, unnamed, but felt in every trembling of the earth. It is easy to imagine them. Families aboard trembling vessels, carrying whatever relics the fire had not devoured. They brought their gods with them, small idols wrapped in cloth, their stories whispered to the waves. When they reached new lands, they built new altars, blending one belief into another. Thus, the Bronze Age gods changed their names and faces. What we call mythology may have been the memory of those who fled across the water, reshaping faith to fit a new horizon. It is said that when the rain finally returned to the drought-stricken lands, the people wept not for relief, but for recognition. The drops struck the dry soil with the sound of 1,000 small blessings, and the smell of wet earth rose like incense. The gods had not abandoned them. They had simply waited for them to listen. Even now, the ruins of those temples breathe with quiet divinity. The carved lions of Hattusa, though faceless, still guard the gate. The sanctuaries of Thebes glow faintly in the moonlight. The shattered pillars of Ugarit cast long shadows toward the sea. Every broken stone still carries the warmth of hands that once prayed upon it. It is said that if you walk among them at dusk, when the world is half light and half dream, you can feel it, the thin veil between the human and the divine. The silence hums like a held note, the same silence that filled those temples 3,000 years ago. It is not emptiness, it is expectation. For the gods never truly turn away. They simply move beyond the reach of language, waiting for hearts quiet enough to hear them again. And when the wind sighs through the ruins, through columns worn smooth by centuries of sand, it carries the same soft message, that faith does not die when gods grow silent. It only changes its form. Perhaps that is why the ancients continued to burn their lamps long after the altars were cold. They knew that even in the stillness, something sacred lingers. A presence that asks for nothing, promises nothing, but remains. In a temple ruin far inland, archaeologists once uncovered a wall etched with spirals. Hundreds of them, each slightly different. Some say they represent storms. Others say they were the symbol of the sea peoples themselves, an eternal turning, a cycle of loss and return. The same spiral appears later, carved into stones across the Mediterranean. Like a seed carried by wind, their mark spread quietly, embedding itself into the art and symbols of future ages. In the stone, in the sea, and in the quiet pulse of every living thing. It is said that once the gods turned away, the world began to dream for itself. And in that dream, humanity learned the oldest prayer, not to be answered but to be heard. It is said that silence is not the absence of words, but the memory of them. In the ruins of the old world, along the broken coasts, beneath the dust of palaces and the shadow of fallen temples, the earth still hums with the faint trace of forgotten speech. Not the words themselves, but the rhythm of them, like waves continuing long after the storm has passed. There was a time when the world spoke in many tongues, when letters were carved upon wet clay, upon stone, upon the bronze edge of ritual blades. Every mark was a breath, every sign a promise that thought could outlast the body. But as the Bronze Age sank beneath the weight of hunger and fire, those voices faded. Languages that once bound empires dissolved into air. The gods who had spoken through priests and scribes grew silent, and humanity forgot how to read its own prayers. Archaeologists have uncovered their remnants. Tablets baked into permanence by flame, fragments of scrolls sealed in ash, inscriptions half swallowed by coral. They are the remains of voices that never meant to be eternal. A scribe in Ugarit, a merchant in Byblos, a courtier in Mycenae, each leaving behind a word, a contract, a hymn. Now those marks lie scattered, meaningless to the eye that first beholds them, yet vibrating with the faint tension of meaning. Among them are scripts no living person can read. And so, the sea peoples never truly vanished. The linear A of Minoan Crete, inscribed on small clay tablets that bear lists of offerings and inventories of harvests, remains mute despite a century of study. The Cypro-Minoan script, written on the island of Cyprus during the years of collapse, has resisted every attempt at translation. Even the languages we believe we understand, Akkadian, Ugaritic, Hittite, speak in fragments, in partial sentences broken by time. It is said that when a language dies, a way of seeing the world dies with it. The Hittites had a word for divine order that meant both breath and justice. The scribes of Ugarit wrote of the sea as if it were a living mind. The Mycenaeans described kingship not as power, but as guarding the song. Each of these meanings, delicate, untranslatable, has vanished into the silence between the surviving words. Yet the silence is not empty. It is full of echoes. In the early 20th century, archaeologists at Knossos unearthed the clay tablets of Linear B, a script related to, but distinct from, Linear A. For decades, it too was indecipherable until a young linguist, Michael Ventris, realized it was an early form of Greek. The moment the first word emerged, after 3,000 years of silence, scholars described it as hearing the dead speak. Words like wanax, king, and paroduwakeo, grain worker, simple, practical terms yet charged with the weight of ages. Imagine it. A symbol pressed into clay by a human hand before the Trojan War, understood again by another human hand thousands of years later. Two minds touching across time through dust and symbol. In that instant, the silence broke, and the ancient world inhaled once more. Still, there are others who remain unspoken. The tablets of Linear A, the inscriptions of the Phaistos disc, the strange hybrid scripts of the Sea Peoples, all continue to resist translation. Some believe they are not languages at all, but codes, prayers, or songs recorded phonetically. Others think they are lost dialects orphaned when their people vanished. They dissolved into those they conquered, became the blood and breath of the New World. Their names disappeared, but their legacy lingered in the architecture, the myths, the very cadence of the languages that rose after them. It is said that one day, when humanity learns how to listen differently, the lost tongues will speak again. not through decipherment but through resonance. For words have a pulse that lingers in the objects they name. The clay remembers the warmth of the hands that shaped it. The stylus remembers the rhythm of its motion. Even if the meaning fades, the act of writing remains. On the island of Cyprus, divers once recovered a bronze ingot inscribed with unfamiliar signs, spirals and crosses, dots arranged like stars. No one could read it, yet everyone who saw it felt its gravity. It was as if the object itself wanted to be understood. Some whispered that it carried the map of a journey, others that it was a message to the gods of the deep. But perhaps it was simply a fragment of language, a breath caught in metal, waiting for an ear that no longer exists. In Egypt, where hieroglyphs once covered every temple wall, the knowledge of reading them faded entirely by the time of the Romans. For centuries they stood mute, intricate, beautiful, and silent, until the Rosetta Stone was found. Its parallel texts unlocked their meaning, and the voices of the pharaohs returned. But what of those civilizations that left no translation? What of the scripts whose echoes have no bridge to cross? They linger like ghosts in the human imagination, the last words of a world that drowned. And yet, perhaps that is their purpose now. Not to be read, but to be felt. They remind us that every language is temporary, that speech itself is a fragile thread we spin against eternity. It is said that the sea peoples, as they journeyed across the waves, carved small symbols into the wood of their ships: circles, spirals, waves. None of them have survived, but some believe those signs were meant to keep memory afloat, to mark their names against the oblivion of the sea. The ocean has taken their ships, their kingdoms, their words, but not their silence. Their silence still moves through us, the inheritance of 1,000 vanished tongues. And perhaps this is why we still write, still carve, still speak into the dark. Every word is an act of defiance against forgetting. Every letter is a reaching out to something beyond death. The ancients knew this. That is why they pressed their stories into clay, why they carved them into stone, so that even when the gods turned away, their voices might remain. It is said that if you stand in the ruins of an old city, Ugarit, Knossos, Hattusa, and close your eyes, you can almost hear it. A murmur rising from the stones, faint and steady, like breath. It is the sound of meaning without understanding, of memory without speech. Somewhere along the shore, a single jar remains unbroken. Perhaps that is the language of the lost, not one to be translated, but one to be listened to. A language spoken not by tongues, but by time itself. And when you finally walk away, leaving the ruins behind to their moonlight and dust, you carry a trace of it within you, that wordless whisper of all who came before, all who wrote and prayed and sang, hoping not to be forgotten. It is said that no language truly dies. It only becomes another form of silence. And in that silence, if you are still enough, you can hear the world remembering how to speak. It is said that the sea is the oldest witness. Before there were empires or kings, before the first city drew breath, the sea was already speaking. Not in words, but in rhythm. It has never forgotten that language. Beneath its shimmering skin lie the ruins of 1,000 dreams. Broken amphorae, stone anchors, fragments of shipwrecks now softened by coral and time. The waves fold over them endlessly, whispering their stories to the sand. And though the shore changes, though kingdoms rise and fall, the sea remains the same, vast, patient, unending, holding everything the earth has chosen to forget. When we speak of the Bronze Age, of its rise and its slow descent into silence, what we are truly speaking of is memory, and no memory is deeper than the oceans. The same waters that carried the ships of Ugarit, of Mycenae, of Egypt, still move beneath the same moon. The same currents that bore the sea peoples toward unknown coasts still breathe across the reefs and plains below. The world above has changed beyond recognition, but below, the sea keeps its archive. Archaeologists have found fragments of that archive. The Ulubran shipwreck off the coast of Turkey, its cargo still resting in the depths after more than 3,000 years. Copper from Cyprus, glass from the Levant, ivory from Africa, amber from the north. Every object a thread in a web of connection that once bound the known world together. It is all there still, gently cradled by sand and salt. Sometimes divers say they can feel it, a hush, a presence as they descend. The water grows colder, the light softens into green and gold, and then the outline of the ship appears, like a memory rising from the mind of the planet. The wood is gone, the hull dissolved, but the shape remains. Amphorae stand like sleeping sentinels, their contents long vanished, yet their arrangement still deliberate, still purposeful. It is as if the sea itself has decided to preserve the intention of what was lost. Inside it, grains of sand, not from one place, but many carried from coast to coast. Perhaps it was meant as an offering, or perhaps as a keepsake. The sea has no need for such distinctions. The sea peoples, those nameless wanderers, may have sailed these same depths. Their oars cut through this same water. Their voices, long vanished, may have once echoed between these same cliffs. The sea has taken their names, their cities, their languages, but it has not taken their presence. That remains, suspended in the currents, translated into motion and tide. It is said that the sea does not destroy, it transforms. Wood becomes coral, bronze becomes green with life, bones become sand, and sand becomes shore. What was once human becomes part of the endless breathing of the deep. Even memory here is circular, nothing ends, it only changes its form. Perhaps that is why so many of the world's myths begin or end in the ocean. The flood of Gilgamesh, the voyage of Odysseus, the drowning of Atlantis, the crossing of Moses, all are echoes of the same truth, that water is both the beginning and the end, the cradle and the grave. The ancients knew this. They did not see the sea as a barrier but as a threshold, a mirror of the heavens, an image of eternity that moved. When night falls upon the Mediterranean and the horizon disappears into darkness, the stars reflect upon the surface like scattered silver. The boundary between sky and sea dissolves. It is in that moment, perhaps, that the dead speak, not in words but in glimmers. The constellations above and their reflections below become one story, told twice. Imagine standing at the edge of that water, as the people of the Bronze Age once did. Behind you, the land, cracked, silent, holding the ruins of everything known. Before you, the sea, endless, alive, whispering. You step forward, the tide touches your feet, and for an instant you understand. All that is lost has only gone to rest beneath this breath of salt and light. It is said that in the temple of Ammonius at Thebes, one priest, writing in the age of collapse, carved a final inscription. All things return to the water. The line was nearly erased by time, but it survived enough to be read. Perhaps he had watched ships vanish from the horizon, or seen his own city fading into sand, and knew that the sea would carry even those memories. In that way, the sea became the world's library, not of words, but of echoes. Each wave a page, each tide a translation. The wrecks beneath its surface are not graves. They are stories still being written in motion. At dusk, the horizon turns to bronze, a final echo of the age that bore that name. The waves come gently, like the closing of a book. It is in this silence that one understands the truth hidden beneath centuries of interpretation. The fall of the Bronze Age was not a single catastrophe, but a slow unraveling, a quiet surrender to time. Modern oceanographers say the Mediterranean is one of the youngest seas on Earth, reborn after a time when it had nearly vanished, its basin dry and cracked, long before humans walked upon its shores. The sea has died and been reborn before. It knows what it is to lose everything and return. Perhaps that is why it has such patience with our forgetting. It is said that if you listen to the ocean long enough, you begin to hear layers, the hiss of the present wave, the murmur of deeper currents, and below even that, something older. Not a sound, exactly, but a feeling, the memory of a world that never ended, only shifted beneath the weight of time. There are moments when the sea seems almost to breathe, the tide exhaling against the rocks, the foam retreating like a sigh. In those moments, it feels as though the world itself is remembering the hands that built ships and cities, remembering the voices that sang to vanished gods, remembering even the silence that followed when the last fire burned out. Perhaps that is why so many people find peace beside the sea. This constancy reassures us that nothing is truly lost. The sea does not forget, it holds. It holds the echoes of languages, the warmth of vanished suns, the dust of thrones and temples and prayers. It holds us, too, in its vast, forgiving rhythm. When the archaeologists leave their sites, when the lights of their boats fade and only the stars remain, the sea closes over the ruins once more. The waves smooth the sand. The silence returns. But it is not an ending. It is the same silence that has always followed the last word of every story, the silence that is not emptiness, but rest. It is said that the sea dreams in centuries, and in those dreams, all things that were lost rise again, luminous, weightless, unbroken, ships drifting under silver moons, voices calling softly from the dark, cities gleaming beneath the waves. Maybe the sea people still sail there, forever between horizons, their oars stirring the ancient waters of memory. Maybe the gods they carried, the prayers they whispered, are still alive in the slow motion of the tide. Maybe everything we think is gone is only waiting, just below the surface, for us to remember how to listen. And yet, the sea endures, for the sea remembers all that was, and in its remembering, keeps the world alive. Every wave, a heartbeat. Every tide, a breath. Every silence, a promise that nothing is ever truly lost. And so, as the night deepens and the water darkens to mirror the sky, the sea continues its quiet song, the same song it sang before history, the same it will sing long after we are gone. It is not a requiem. It is a lullaby, for the living, for the lost, and for the endless world beneath. It is said that every story, no matter how vast, must one day fall quiet. It has seen every empire rise and crumble, every harbor filled and emptied. Beneath its surface, time has no dominion. The same tides that carried the sea peoples carry us still, our footprints fading just as theirs did. Not because it has ended, but because it has circled back to where it began, to the silence before the first word, to the stillness before the first wave. The Bronze Age, that age of light and trade and prayer, did not die in flame alone. It drifted gently into memory. Now only the sea remembers. It remembers the harbors filled with sails like wings. It remembers the laughter of markets in Ugarit, the songs of the scribes in Hattusa, the golden sun on the stones of Mycenae. It remembers the smell of cedar and smoke, the taste of salt and honey, the hum of oars cutting the horizon. It remembers the hands that reached out to the gods, and the moment when the gods fell silent. All of it drifts there still. Empires dissolved into silt, alphabets turned to coral, prayers mingled with tide. The ocean has taken their form, their voice, their dust, and made of them a single thing: continuity. It is said that when the last of the sea peoples vanished beyond the western horizon, the waters closed behind them with neither triumph nor sorrow. The waves kept their rhythm as they always had. In that moment, the world began again. The Iron Age rose from the ashes, language reshaped itself, and the gods, weary though they were, took on new names. But beneath it all, the sea remained, watching, breathing, remembering. Perhaps that is the true lesson of these forgotten shores, that all things return to water. The archaeologists who dive into its depths today do not descend into darkness. They descend into time. Every amphora they uncover, every tablet they lift from the sand, is not a discovery, but a reunion. A conversation continued after 3,000 years of pause. And as they rise again toward the light, the world above waits, unchanged in its forgetting. We, too, are part of that forgetting. We build and burn and build again, believing our walls and words will outlast the tide. Yet the sea knows better. It has seen eternity pass like seasons. It has held the bones of kings and the shells of children, and made no distinction between them. It keeps no hierarchies, no borders, only the soft rhythm of dissolution. And perhaps that is its wisdom, that nothing is ever truly gone, only changed. The language of the lost becomes the song of the waves. The thrones that fell become sand beneath the next traveler's feet. The gods who turned away return as wind. The fire that consumed the cities becomes the light of dawn. Everything circles back to the same breath. It is said that if you stand beside the sea at night, when the wind is still and the stars hang low, you can hear it. A sound older than language, softer than memory. It is not the waves. It is the pulse of history itself, still beating beneath the water. Perhaps that is what the sea peoples heard when they sailed. Not a call to conquer, but a call to continue. To carry forward the fragments of what was into what might be. To remember that even when worlds fall silent, life continues to whisper. And so, the sea continues its endless remembrance. Carries the weight of all that was lost, and all that will be lost again. It holds our past, our reflection, our promise. The tide rises, the tide falls, the story folds into itself. Language, power, memory, each drawn back into the vastness from which they came. It is said that at the end of all things, when the last light fades and the last word has been spoken, the sea will still move, quietly, steadily, like a breath that never ceases. And in that movement will be everything. The shore where empires sank, the city that dreamed of fire, the oracle that whispered to stone, the ships that vanished into mist, the gods that turned away, the languages that forgot themselves, and all of us, folded gently into its rhythm, becoming once more what we have always been. It is said that if you stand by this coast long enough, with your hand resting on the stone and your breath aligned with the tide, you can almost hear it, the faint murmur of a distant world, the whisper of a name the sea refuses to give back. A single tide, a single memory, a world held forever in the sea's soft, unending song. Perhaps it was never meant to. Perhaps the silence itself is the only answer left. For in the end, the sea holds all that we lose, not to destroy it, but to cradle it in its slow, eternal rhythm. The same rhythm that once rocked the ships of the nameless wanderers. The same rhythm that guides us now, as we drift towards sleep, listening, not for what was lost, but for what still echoes beneath the tide. And when the final wave recedes, only this remains, the hush of water, the shimmer of starlight, and the ancient truth whispered by every shore since time began. Everything returns to the sea. It is said there once stood a city by the edge of the sea, where the sun set in bronze and rose in gold, a place where the scent of cedar and salt mingled with the breath of merchants and the quiet footsteps of scribes. They called it Ugarit, though time has worn that name thin, leaving only an echo upon the northern coast of what is now Syria. Long before the prophets, before the alphabets of Greece and Rome, before the world learned to speak through ink and page, this city dreamed of permanence. It built its temples high, its harbor wide, and its heart upon the rhythm of trade. Ships from Cyprus and Mycenae, from Egypt and Crete, once anchored here, their sails heavy with tin and wine, ivory and grain. And each evening, as the sky dimmed into copper, the sound of prayers rose with the smoke of the lamps, offerings to Baal, Lord of Storms, and Eshira, Mother of the Deep. But dreams are fragile things, and even the most sacred flame can turn upon itself. Around the year 1190 BCE, when the known world began to tremble, Ugarit too began to hear the first whispers of ruin. Famine crept from the east, and the earth shook beneath the western mountains. The letters sent to neighboring kings grew more desperate, more hurried. One such tablet, still preserved, carries the words of a final plea. The enemy ships are here. The city burns. The gods have turned their faces away. The tablet's clay was still damp when fire came to the palace. It was baked not by the sun, but by the heat of its own destruction. Those ships, the enemy ones, may have belonged to the sea peoples, those elusive wanderers who appeared like ghosts across the Mediterranean, raiders, exiles, refugees of collapsing empires. No one knows from where they came. Some spoke of islands swallowed by storms, others of homelands turned to drought. What is known is this: they came when the world was already unraveling, when trade routes had failed and kingdoms were hollowed by hunger. They came like a tide that could neither be stopped nor understood. Ugarit met them at the edge of dusk. Its walls stood proud, its archives filled with thousands of tablets, its priests confident that the gods would protect their city. But on that night, the wind turned, and the sea carried in its breath the scent of smoke. It is said the moon was blood-red above the harbor, reflecting itself in the water like a coin dropped into the deep. Flames caught on the cedar roofs, on the ships moored too tightly together, on the very air. Some ran toward the temple, clutching idols of clay. Some to the sea, carrying scrolls and tablets wrapped in linen. But nothing escaped the fire. And yet, in that same destruction, something miraculous occurred. For the clay tablets that were once soft and fragile, made only to last a few lifetimes, were hardened by the flames. They became stone. The fire that devoured their world preserved their words. When archaeologists uncovered them nearly 3,000 years later, they found more than 20,000 fragments of memory. Treaties, hymns, poems, and the first known alphabet carved by human hands. The letters of Ugarit, small wedges pressed into clay, would echo through centuries. From Phoenician traders, those symbols would find their way to Greece, to Rome, to us. Every alphabet that ever formed a prayer or poem carries within it the ember of the city that burned by the sea. If you walk those ruins today, near the modern city of Latakia, the earth still breathes with a faint warmth. The walls of palaces crumble softly into the soil. The gate to Baal's temple still opens toward the sea, though no worshippers remain to cross it. The air smells faintly of dust and salt and old cedar, as though the fire still lingers beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered. When the wind moves through the broken chambers, it makes a sound like whispering, a language that no one alive can understand but every soul seems to feel. It is said that no city truly dies. It only changes its form. Ugarit did not vanish. It became language, became symbol, became the memory of communication itself. From its ashes came the written breath of humanity, the way thought could move across time without a body, the way we could speak to those who have never seen our faces. Its destruction was, perhaps, the birth of the modern world. And yet, the silence that followed must have been unbearable. The sea peoples moved on, their ships like shadows disappearing into the horizon. The waves washed over the blackened harbor. The ashes settled into the soil, mingling with grain and bone. The gods of Ugarit fell quiet, their temples swallowed by sand. But the fire they kindled in language did not fade. Sometimes, at twilight, when the sea is calm and the air still, those who visit the ruins say they can feel a faint pulse beneath their feet. Not of flame, but of memory. As if the city still dreams, still remembers the moment it was both destroyed and made eternal. The alphabet it birthed continues to hum quietly in every written word, in every whisper of ink across paper. Perhaps that is why the world continues to return to these ruins. Not to mourn what was lost, but to listen. For in the hush between waves, the city still speaks. It tells us that creation and destruction are one motion, that memory itself is born from the ashes of forgetting. And when night finally falls upon the coast, the stars rise in the same pattern they once traced above the palace roofs. The sea moves with the same slow rhythm, folding against the stones as it always has. In that sound, soft, endless, unbroken, one can almost hear the faint song of scribes writing by lamplight, of priests whispering into the dark, of mothers calling their children home before the storm. It is said that the fire that destroyed Ugarit did not end its story. It carried it forward through alphabets, through languages, through time itself, until it found us. Perhaps that is why, even now, when we write, when we name, when we remember, we are, in some distant way, continuing the dream of that city by the sea. A city that dreamed of fire, and through fire, learned how to never be forgotten. It is said that beneath the calm skin of the Mediterranean, there sleeps a fleet that never returned home. Their masts are gone, their sails turned to salt and coral, but their shadows still drift beneath the waves like ghosts tracing the memory of wind. The sea does not forget. It keeps what the land cannot, the bones of empires, the whispers of trade, the weight of unanswered prayers. And somewhere beneath that shifting blue expanse lies what many believe to be the silent grave of the sea peoples, the wanderers who ended an age. In the long dusk of the late Bronze Age, the sea was not a barrier but a road. From the coasts of Greece to the deltas of Egypt, from the harbors of Anatolia to the Isles of Cyprus, Ships carried copper, tin, linen, grain, and faith. The known world was connected by the pulse of its waves. Every tide carried messages between kings written on clay. Every wind bore the scent of distant fires. And then, suddenly, that world began to fade. Archaeologists still find traces. Anchors shaped like crescents, blades of bronze fused with coral, jars of resin sealed and sunken beside amphorae of oil. They tell us that trade routes once dense as spider silk began to snap one by one. Earthquakes shook the palaces of Mycenae. Drought cracked the fields of Canaan. And across that broken map came ships, strange, dark, and desperate, filled with those who sought refuge and found only resistance. Some believe they came from the Aegean, survivors of collapsing kingdoms. Others whisper of lost islands, places swallowed by the sea itself, perhaps Santorini's fiery shadow, perhaps lands that never had names. They were a people without one home but many hungers. Wherever they arrived, the world trembled. It is said their ships were like no others, long and narrow, their prows carved into beasts of the deep. They rode not as conquerors but as a tide of necessity, their oars striking the surface in solemn rhythm, like the heartbeats of an ending era. To those who saw them approach, they were omens. To those who followed them, they were salvation. The Egyptians called them invaders, the foreign sea people of the northern lands. Reliefs carved in stone at Medinet Habu, beneath the gaze of Pharaoh Ramesses III, still show the battle. Ships locked together, arrows flying, waves churning with bodies and broken shields. Yet even there, in the rigid grace of carved stone, the battle feels less like victory than inevitability. A storm meeting the shore. But the sea tells a quieter story. For in its depths, near Cyprus, divers have found shipwrecks that seem neither Egyptian nor Greek, filled with mixed cargo, Cypriot copper, Canaanite jars, Aegean pottery. It is as if one world had spilled into another, all boundaries dissolved. Some of those vessels never belonged to kings or armies. They were the last hope of displaced peoples, carrying what little they could: tools, idols, seeds, memories. Their journey was not conquest. It was survival. Imagine one such ship, drifting under a bruised sky, its crew silent, its captain watching the horizon as storms gather behind him. The sea glows faintly in the night, bioluminescent creatures rising to the surface like stars reborn beneath the water. The air is heavy with salt and fear. Somewhere, a woman hums a lullaby in a language that will one day vanish. A child touches the carved prow, tracing its lines as though they might spell a home that no longer exists. When dawn comes, there is no land in sight, only the endless breath of the sea, the slow mourning of its waves. Some of those ships would make landfall, some would not. Yet their story did not sink. It spread like light beneath the water, illuminating the twilight between eras. For from their disappearance rose something new. When the sea peoples came, the palaces of the old world fell, but so too did the boundaries of class and empire. In the ashes of the Bronze Age, the Iron Age quietly began. New languages, simpler tools, humbler gods. The world had changed hands. It is said that every wave that touches the shore once touched the wrecks that sleep beneath the sea. Each current carries with it the faintest trace of that forgotten armada, the salt of their sweat, the bronze dust of their weapons, the prayers they whispered to gods who no longer answered. The sea became their memory, their tomb, their song. And though their names have been lost, their absence still shapes the world. The routes they broke became the paths of new nations. The myths they carried became the seeds of later legends. Tales of Odysseus wandering endlessly, of islands swallowed by wrathful tides, of people seeking land beneath strange constellations. Perhaps those stories were not inventions but echoes, softened by centuries into parable. In the quiet chambers of museums, their artifacts rest behind glass. Fragments of helmets, beads of faience, shards of pottery that once held wine for the voyage. Scholars study them by lamplight, tracing the faint spiral marks that appear again and again, carved by unknown hands. Some say the spiral was a symbol of their faith, a sign of eternal return, of the sea's cycle of taking and giving. It appears on stones in Sardinia, on temples in Anatolia, on the cliffs of Crete. Perhaps they left it as a reminder that no people truly vanish, they only change their form. At night, when the Mediterranean grows still, fishermen say the sea glows faintly in places. Strange, moving lights beneath the surface, drifting slowly as if the oars of invisible ships still cut through the dark. They call it the passing of the wanderers. They throw a small portion of their catch back into the waves, an offering for those who never reached the shore. And in the silence that follows, if the wind is soft and the stars hang low, one might almost hear it. The slow creak of timbers, the rhythmic pull of oars, the sound of voices murmuring in languages long forgotten. It is said that the sea keeps no secrets, only stories told too quietly for the living to hear. The ships that sleep beneath its surface are not lost. They are waiting, suspended in the deep, dreaming of the world they once knew. Perhaps one night, when the moon is thin and the tide breathes against the coast, their story will rise again. Not in war, not in conquest, but in remembrance. For the sea does not end where the shore begins. It continues inward, into the heart, carrying with it all that has been lost, all that drifts between memory and myth. And if you listen closely, as the waves fold into one another, you might hear the faint refrain of that forgotten armada. Not a cry of battle, but a lullaby of exile, echoing softly across eternity. The sound of oars dipping, the whisper of salt on wood, the eternal rhythm of those who left and those who never returned. It is said that deep within the mountains of Anatolia, where wind moves through cracks in the earth like a sigh of the gods, there once stood a temple built not for worship, but for listening. Its stones were carved before the Iron Age had begun, before even the word oracle had found its name. Here, the high priests of Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, came to hear what could not be spoken, the warnings of the earth, the trembling of the stars, the breath of gods withdrawing from men. Now only fragments remain, great blocks of limestone scattered like the bones of a sleeping giant, stairways that lead to nothing, doorways that open into wind. The carvings are faint, worn by centuries of rain, yet their shapes still suggest something sacred: spirals, wings, and eyes half closed as if in eternal contemplation. When the evening light touches them, they seem to breathe again, glowing faintly in the orange dusk. It was here, the elders said, that the oracle of the crumbling stone once spoke. Not in words, but in tremors, in whispers that rose from deep within the rock. The priests would press their palms to the floor and feel the earth's slow pulse. They said it carried messages from the gods, warnings of famine, omens of war, the sorrow of storms yet to come. When the ground shook, the oracle was restless. When the wind fell silent, the gods had turned away. In the years before the world unraveled, the oracle spoke often. It is said the stones themselves grew warm, and the torches in the chamber burned blue. The priests heard something like the sound of distant thunder, but the sky was clear. They cast bones and poured oil into sacred basins, reading the ripples for signs. The message came again and again, always the same: the sea is coming. At first, they thought it meant rain or the return of trade. But then, the omens darkened. Birds flew inland and did not return. Wells turned brackish. The harvest failed, and the stars shifted from their paths. Across the land, the great empire that had ruled for centuries began to fracture. Hattusa, once the beating heart of the Hittites, fell silent, one temple at a time. Archaeologists who walk there now find walls still blackened by ancient flame. The archives, once filled with tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, lie in shards. Some still bear the royal seal of Suppiluliuma, the last known king, who sent desperate letters to neighboring lands begging for grain and mercy. None came. The letters ended abruptly. The clay hardened before the response arrived. And so the oracle's final prophecy was fulfilled. The sea did come, not as water but as people. The sea peoples, whose movements rippled across the eastern Mediterranean, reached even these inland kingdoms. Armies dissolved, trade collapsed, temples were abandoned to ivy and silence. The gods who had once been fed by incense were left hungry. The voice of the oracle fell still. But there are those who say the stones still remember. When the wind moves through the ruins, it makes a low, humming sound, like breath drawn through hollow bone. The villagers who live near the site call it the sighing earth. Some refuse to pass by after sunset. Others bring small offerings, bread, honey, coins, leaving them on the cracked altar for luck. They say the oracle listens still, though no one dares ask questions anymore. The Hittites had believed that every rock possessed a soul, that mountains were the resting places of gods. They built sanctuaries not to confine divinity, but to let it move freely, air, water, stone, and spirit all bound in one sacred rhythm. In their carvings, the gods walk side by side with mortals, each figure slightly taller than the next, like a procession toward heaven. When those carvings fade, they do so in sequence, the smallest first, then the tallest, as if time itself honors the order. It is here, among these fading lines, that one begins to feel how thin the veil between past and present truly is. The same wind that brushes your face once carried the incense of kings. The same ground that trembles beneath your feet once spoke prophecies in a language no one now remembers. Some archaeologists say that an earthquake ended the Hittite Empire, not fire, not invasion. They find evidence of tectonic fractures beneath the ruins, traces of sudden collapse. Perhaps the final voice of the oracle was the earth itself, breaking open beneath the weight of its own silence. And yet, one cannot help but wonder if the priests heard it coming. If, in those last nights, they gathered around the altar, hands pressed to stone, listening to the slow groan of the deep. Did they understand? Did they feel the gods withdrawing, step by step, into the unseen? Did they sense that an age was ending? When night falls now over those mountains, and the stars return to their eternal places, the ruins of Hattusa glow faintly in the moonlight, pale stones, still aligned with the constellations they once honored. The great gate of the lions still stands, though one of the beasts has lost its face. Beyond it, the air cools, and the silence deepens. It is said that silence, too, is a kind of prophecy. The ancients believed that when the gods no longer spoke, it was because they had already said everything. What remained was for humanity to remember. And so, the oracle of the crumbling stone remains, not speaking, not silent, but listening, to the footsteps of those who wander its broken halls, to the wind that hums through its corridors, to the faint echo of civilizations that rose and fell with the same heartbeat. Perhaps the oracle was never a voice at all, but a mirror, showing back to us the tremor of our own impermanence. The same sea that took the Hittites still laps against our shores. The same earth that shook their temples will one day swallow ours. The same stars that watched their fall still burn quietly overhead, marking the slow rhythm of eternity. It is said that if you stand there at dawn, when the first light spills across the ruins, and press your hand to the stone, you can feel something faint. Not warmth, not cold, but a steady pulse. A reminder that time does not destroy, it only transforms. That the voice of the oracle was never lost, only changed. And in that moment, when the wind falls still and the breath of the earth rises to meet your own, you will understand why the ancients came here to listen. Because beneath all the noise of the living world, there is a deeper sound, the slow, endless hum of creation remembering itself. The oracle spoke it once, and still it speaks, though no one hears the words. Not in thunder, but in silence. Not in revelation, but in the echo that follows.